and World Society, organized by the Indonesian International Islamic University, Triple IU or UIII. And then this is held by the Faculty of Social Sciences Research Center. The name of the research center that we just established, the university is also, as you know, just a new university. So the research center is called the Center for Muslim Politics and World Society, or COMPOSE. And then this is our first symposium. We plan to have it annually, coincide with the publication of our would-be journal as well, which is called Muslim Politics Review. And for those of you who are working in this area on Muslim politics, of course, the book that would come to mind easily is Muslim Politics, co-authored by Professor James Piscatori and Dale Ackerman, first published in 1994. And everybody know how the book has been very influential globally in this area of research. And then, of course, then the second edition of the book was published a few years later, 2004, in which Professor James Piscatori and Dale Ackerman included new developments such as the war in Iraq, 9/11, and so on and so forth, and how it shaped the landscape of the Muslim world. And since then, of course, there have been changes across the globe. Social media came into being, and then not to mention various catastrophic events, the pandemic, and so on and so forth. So we at the UIIE thought that it would be a very timely gathering if we could have that inviting scholars who've been working on this area, and then to reflect and to probably, if we can put our head together, and will help, in particular us at the university, as well as the, of course, the academic environment in Indonesia, to discuss this issue with new perspective. And then that's why we have the symposium, and that's why we have this in particular session that will get the benefit from the man himself, the author of the book, Professor James Piscatori, who's been very generous with his time. And right now, Professor James Piscatori also teaches at the Indonesian International Islamic University, one full course on the Muslim global affairs, which is his area of expertise. And then that fits with the name of our center. And then our journal carries the title of the book, Muslim Politics Review. So this session will be important for our journal that will be published later next year, with the help of a member of the international board member of the journal, Professor Greg Philly, also part of the member. And then this session, and also the first day session of Greg Philly and Bridget Wells, they put together some ideas as well. So we're gonna put all this wisdom and insights from scholars in our founding edition of the journal, which will be the collection of thoughts from from the speakers here as the founding edition of our journal. It's kind of a statement of what we should be doing with the research on Muslim politics today. Now, let us start with Professor James Piscatori, who of course doesn't need introduction, but now he's with the Center for Political Thought at Durham University in UK. Professor James Piscatori, the screen is yours, and then you can talk as long as you want, because we want to have your wisdom, although we have some kind of a timing, 15 to 20 minutes. But of course, for you, we will be very happy to listen if you exceed the time. Screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Dean Phillips. You shouldn't give me more than 15. I'll take so many more. I'll try to keep to a conscribed time period. But let me thank you and Professor Jamhari and Dr. Sorajuddin and all your colleagues for this opportunity. I'm not used to my work being taken so seriously. So thank you very much for this great opportunity. I think you won't be surprised that this opportunity to revisit Muslim Politics, the book, will probably lead me into certifying that I think we were right in the first place. But I think I'll try to clarify some of the arguments we made and perhaps to try to take it just a bit further. So, you know, it's obvious, and Dean Phillips mentioned this, that so many other events have occurred since we wrote the book. But you know, one of the important points about the book was that it wasn't about current events. It was about conceptual framing. So there are many examples. There are many examples of politics in Muslim societies, and certainly lots of things have occurred since the 2 editions of the book. But they're not necessarily Muslim politics, in inverted commas. They're not exactly the concept itself. So the addition of the adjective Muslim, I think, is more than merely semantic. Politics is a seductive, but I think an incomplete line of explanation. And that basically was the motivation behind the book and what I want to say today. So just to remind us, we earlier defined, Dale Eichmann and I earlier defined Muslim politics as the competition and contest over both the interpretation of symbols and the control of the institutions, formal and informal, that produce and sustain them. So it's about interpretation of symbols, and it's about the control over those who produce them. So rather than claiming that politics conducted by individuals happen to be Muslims is somehow behaviorally different or unique, the approach that we were trying to follow, and I would espouse now, is that it applies to individuals who are motivated by specifically Muslim values. So Muslim politics is a kind of politics, a particular type, which culture broadly shares. So the organizers gave us 3 questions. And this was, the first question was, what is Muslim politics? And so what I've tried to suggest here, and I'll go on now to explain it further, is that it's a particular kind of politics. But we've been handed, kind of received wisdom on this subject, not only on religion and Islam, Islam and politics, but also religion and politics more generally. And in fact, it seems to me that there are 3 biases, which of course you know, and many of you, and perhaps all of you in your work, have dealt in some form with these kinds of biases. So let me just review them very quickly for us in shorthand version. First, there's the Enlightenment ethos of progression towards a secular public order. So for a long time, political development was thought to require that religion should be circumscribed to the private, essentially personal level. We know this. Secondly, politics was, and I would submit still largely is, seen through a structural prism. This is largely due to the established view of political studies that political culture explains neither the causality nor the timing of a political act. Neither the causality nor the timing of a political act. And in order to get those answers, we have to look at structural factors like class, political economy, institutional development. They need to be brought to the center of analysis. And I do think that upon reflection, that in the book, Muslim politics, we could have emphasized structural factors more, that they set the stage for, but did not displace culturally defined politics. But there's a conventional way of also looking at this, which is a state society rubric, and the question of which is strong, which is weak, etc. I think we can at least say that the approach of Muslim politics, the book, was one way of giving societal factors their due. So a third problem is that, and this is, I think, common, though not exclusive, there's a presumption that politics is coercive and based on power. This is often the result of a command and hierarchical image of political decision-making, a top-down approach that complements the statist paradigm. So the cooperative element, the element that later became to be called soft power, is regarded more as influence, but not getting to the heart of politics. And I think those biases, which we have been dealt with, these three, have in a way skewed our analysis. But add to that we have a whole series of theoretical approaches: modernization theory, world system theory, critical theories. And without having the time to go into them, I think we can say that in various ways, they've drawn on these basic biases, these basic assumptions that I've told you about. And to my mind, there's a fault with all of them when it comes to dealing with this problematic of religion, and more specifically, the problematic of Islam. Robert Wuthnow, I think, says it best when he looked at all these various theoretical approaches, and he says, we've been handed a simplified theoretical calculus that makes religion the dependent variable and politics the independent variable. Now, add to that a particularly influential approach to politics, in study of politics, and that's the whole idea of rational choice. But to my mind, it doesn't adequately or fully explain how individual preferences are determined or how collective action results. So political action is thought to result from whatever is deemed to be in the interests of society members. But why individuals adhere to collective enterprises, why they may forego individual preferences for altruistic purposes, I don't think can be simply explained by the threat of loss or sanctions. So what seems missing to me, and again, I'm putting all of this in shorthand form, but what is missing puts us into a very murky world, is political culture. That is the realm of meaning and interpretation. Now, others might call these narratives or stories or symbols. But whatever the term you use, they mobilize people. They move them to action. They set boundaries between the right and the wrong, the permissible and the impermissible. But they also do more. They may structure expectations of rightful or indeed malevolent behavior. So in the process, they can endow or withhold legitimacy in response to a number of actors, and not just the state. I want to remind us that 65 years ago, Wilfred Cantwell Smith described Islam as the form of Muslim civilization, the form. And these were his words. It is essentially the pattern of meaning that economics, politics, and all the other factors in their social life have for the Muslim. It is his orientation to the various ingredients of his life. I think that's worth remembering, that nice sort of summary view of how he sees Islam. But one can't speak of the logic behind Muslim politics without simultaneously thinking of the practical dimensions of how cultural symbols are inherently contested, emerging, and I think porous. So political symbols are subject to dispute and interpretation. So there's contestation. They're emerging in the sense that they're subject to evolution. And they're porous in the sense that there's a lack of rigid borders between them. So street slogans, social media videos, ritualized performances such as Ashura, online fatwa, musical anthems, the nasheeds, among others. I think these are all tangible expressions of an attempt to encapsulate and express political meaning in compressed ways, but yet affective ways. But I always have to say and remind us that these do interact with contextual factors. Everything from social networks, extended families, gender relations, ethnic groups, to awareness of what some people call the deep state, interlinked security, commercial, and military ties. So politics is rooted in times and place, but culture can provide the framework. The framework. So the bottom line to the first question, what do I think is Muslim politics? I would say that the intimate connections between religion and politics are obvious. They're undeniable. Their meanings, however, are not preordained. They are formed and reformed in the cultural arena, which is itself in part, and I emphasize in part, but not wholly shaped by specific context, even by way of resistance to it. So the second question which we were given is, how important is the pandemic era in shaping Muslim politics today? So it seems to me that events like the pandemic are unlikely to alter what I've just said conceptually. But they do highlight two aspects which I think are important. One is, broadly speaking, transnationalism, or I suppose we could more accurately refer to it today as globalization. And the second is paradoxical. Having just said that globalization is one of the points that we should take out of the pandemic era, paradoxically, the residual power of the state, or at least the responsibility of the state to act, also reemerges. So let's take globalization. It seems to me there are three ways that globalization and religion can be linked. First, globalization can stimulate not only the creation of religious networks and social movements, not only their creation, but also an awareness of these as an integral part of the Muslim landscape. We can see this, for example, in expanding Sufi networks, Muslim communities in the West, new civil society, or even Dawah groups. Secondly, an awareness of connectedness and of pressing new problems that they give rise to can inspire that religion is in large part shaped by exogenous forces and cannot be just internalized, cannot be just internal, private affair. Privatization of religion is to be resisted, and Islam seen as inherently public, and therefore political. And a third point about globalization, this awareness of connectedness, such as the pandemic exemplified, also relativizes. So that there are world or global religions is not new. Yet the appreciation of what this means in the case of global Islam may be so. Marshall Hodgson, in his great masterpiece, The Venture of Islam, reminds us that in the late medieval period, roughly from 1250 to 1500, political boundaries were of little consequence. And we know now that transnational and ritually sanctioned activities such as the Hajj, Ziyarat, Rihla, that they continually ensure both mobility and intercultural contacts. But with modern communications and the hybridity of modern societies today, globalized Islam, like all globalized religions, has to deal more urgently with pluralism. How are we alike or different from others and other religions? And crucially, how do we act similarly or differently in society? So I think this confrontation, this relativization, in a way, advances the way that Muslims will need to conceptualize their politics. So that was globalization. I also mentioned a second paradoxical factor. And so that's the other way of thinking of this. And the pandemic gave us an example of renewed emphasis on the state as the most effective level of response, staffing hospitals, devising and regulating new health regimes, dispensing vaccines. So this is consistent with a kind of conventional statist view that I mentioned when conceptualizing politics. And therefore, it may seem that there's nothing different here. It's politics as usual, little to do with Muslim politics. But I remind you what we said, contestation over the controllers of symbols, not only the symbols themselves, is part of the Muslim politics equation. So to the extent that the state is strengthened and uses its institutional machinery to enforce the pandemic remit, it has implications for us. For instance, fatwas were sought and given on the permissibility of COVID vaccines. And by the way, I could go on about this, but I don't have time to develop it. But there are many fatwas on this and in various forms, etc. But what do? Not only do they pronounce on the permissibility of vaccines, but they reinforce the authority of centralized and often controversial bodies, such as MUI in Indonesia and others, and the Ministry of Religious Affairs in Egypt, for example. And this prompts either acquiescence in or opposition to the bureaucratic control of Islam. And similar debates, not only about the permissibility of vaccines, but also went on about whether or not you could suspend the Umrah, whether or not you could suspend Friday prayers, etc. And there were debates across the Muslim world on this. So the pandemic afforded an opportunity for the religious bureaucracy to exert more influence, but it also fed into critical views of state preferences. So for example, Salafis tended to argue that this was another judgment from God for having deviated from the straight path of Islam. But some of them zeroed in on the bad treatment of the Uyghurs. But the fact that their own governments, for example, the Saudi, the Iranian, and Pakistani governments, are thought to have done little to protect the Uyghurs, certainly must be seen, therefore, as a criticism of their own governments. Radical Islamist groups, perhaps typically, conflated opposition to the Iraqi and the American governments against their usual targets, the perfidious Shia, the perfidious Crusaders. ISIS, for example, accused the Shia of responsibility for the pandemic in Iraq and said it was a sign, quote unquote, that they should abandon polytheism, quote unquote. And with the spread of COVID, it was recast into ISIS's other narrative, that it was a painful torment, quote, for all Crusader nations, etc. So my point for the second question is, rather than globalization flattening the field and homogenizing culture, it can stimulate culturally specific debates and contestation. The pandemic, and I think other globalized crises, may give rise to heightened consciousness of localized and, importantly at times, religious differences. So Muslim politics is not just a legitimizing device for power considerations, but the putting forward and crafting of religious agendas in the public arena, often in response to the status quo. So I think there is a reaffirmation to some extent of the status quo, and this may be a response in some ways to it. And so the third and final question was, how should we study Muslim politics today? So let me say that I think you all know there's a kind of embarrassment today, academically, in relying on once what was thought to be an integral part of modernization theory, that is political culture. Michael Hudson noted its problematic aspects very well. How do you know what political culture is? Reliance on temporary data, opinion surveys, or else you make a static generalization. But there are also unitary assumptions. There's also the problem of reductionism. So there are clearly problems with political culture. I myself mentioned a few minutes ago that many academics will argue that it doesn't really tell us about the causality or the timing of political acts. But even Hudson said, and mindful of these dangers, he concluded, quote, "We should be careful not to throw out the political culture baby with the Orientalist bathwater. Let's be a bit measured about how we approach it." So this in telegraphed form is what I've been trying to argue here. And what I propose is having relevance for the future political study of Muslim societies. Muslim politics as a concept was never meant to be a totalizing, comprehensive explanation for the politics of these Muslim societies. It was never meant to be a totalizing, comprehensive explanation, but to shed light on the form that those politics at times takes on embedded, though not inflexible, normative orientations. So the goal is to demonstrate not only the connections between values and political behavior, but also the need for that connection or that design, to use Geertzian terminology, or orientation, to use the language of Wilfred Cantwell Smith, to use those connections, one, to see that they're self-consciously expressed and formalized, self-consciously expressed and formalized by various agents who take upon themselves to speak for political Islamic authority, who presume to be an Islamic authority. And two, to do so through processes which are often contested. So we need to take that connection and to see that it's self-consciously expressed through agents who presume to be Islamic, and that they do so through processes which are often contested. So the book, Muslim Politics, like all social science, could be considered a product of its time. But as I've mentioned, the inquiry into the religion-politics connection brought us then, and I argue it still does, into larger conceptual terrain that reaches beyond the politics as usual line of inquiry, which typically either ignored or overstated the role of religion. So my final point, like religion itself, Muslim politics is a window. It's a window through which we can hopefully supplement our understanding of some, but patently not all, collective action, with an appreciation for the meanings that people invest in it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor James Piscatori, for such a rich presentation on your reflection about the book and what we should be doing next. And you started with warning us. I think it's it's needed of the three biases that we've been committing in doing research in this area. And then you remind us to bring in the, if I may use the word, bring in the societal factor back into the analysis. Because this is area where we are discussing meanings of culture, which is contested and then evolve over time, and it implies that there is contestation as well. And then I think this is a very insightful thought from you for all of us. Now, before I move on to our second speaker, Professor Lily Rahim, if I may invite those who are attending this session, if you have questions, type in the Q&A box of your Zoom screen down below. So later on, we can read out your questions, and then the speakers might be able to respond. So use the Q&A box. Now our second speaker, who is also very generous with her time for us, Professor Lily Rahim. She's a fellow at the Al-Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. But now she is in Sydney. So I believe it's already very late in Sydney. And then we really thankful to Professor Lily Rahim, who agrees to do this as well, to respond to Professor James Piscatori's insights and put her thoughts on the questions that we posed, the three questions that we asked all the speakers. Professor Lily Rahim, the screen is yours.
Yes, good evening, everybody. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank, in particular, the organizers of the symposium, especially Dr. Phillips Vermont, for organizing this event. I also apologize for being slightly late in joining this symposium. I did have computer problems, having come from overseas and dealing with various computers and not quite sure which screens work and don't. So anyhow, I'm really excited to be part of this project. My talk will be slightly different from that of Professor the previous Professor Piscatori, less conceptual, and it will be focused on Muslim politics in Malaysia But what I've done is I placed it within a broader global context and focus on the question of how the differences and similarities between Muslim and non-Muslim politics. And what I've highlighted are the similarities between, in particular, the Muslim politics, the alliance between ethno-nationalists and religious nationalists in many parts of the Muslim world and the non-Muslim world. So I've titled this presentation, Unsettled National Questions and Contested Visions of the Nation State, and why it is important to safeguard the secular democratic state, or sometimes referred to as the passive, inclusive, passive, secular democratic state. So, settled, what do I mean by unsettled national questions? And as I've noted earlier, I placed it in comparative perspective. Now, nation building can be readily destabilized when foundational national questions and principles remain unsettled. So, in other words, there is no clear consensus on these foundational national questions and principles. The debate on unsettled national questions have often been raised by minorities, religious, ethnic minorities and other minority groups, demanding equal citizenship rights. And these demands have triggered majoritarian backlashes in both the Muslim world as well as the non-Muslim world. These debates are often expediently played out during critical political junctures, which often generate political opportunity structures for the nation state to then be reimagined. Now, this reimagining could involve reforming state structures, state institutions, and formulating a new national narrative. This process of reimagining has occurred in ostensibly mature liberal democracies, such as the United States, former Soviet bloc states, such as Poland and Hungary, democracies, you could say fledgling democracies such as Indonesia, states that have experienced significant democratic reversals, such as India and Turkey, others that have suffered political setbacks following democratic breakthrough elections, such as Malaysia, military repression in authoritarian and ethnocracies, such as Myanmar or Burma, and even one-party communist states. And in many of these countries, we find ethno and or religious nationalist forces playing a key role in propelling the reimagining of the state. Now let's look at the United States. Trump's ardent supporters, who are they? White nationalists and Christian evangelicals, intent on maintaining, one could argue, white Christian numerical dominance. Now, there's various data that suggests that in 2 decades or slightly more, the non-white population will be the numerical majority. And many argue that this is a reason why these Trump supporters have have pushed for, the mega United States. Mega meaning reassertion of white Christian numerical dominance. Now, if we look at Putin's invasion of Ukraine, well, it appears as though this has been rationalized by the narrative of the Russosphere, a sphere supposedly under threat internally within the region, threatened by NATO and the West, so to speak. Now, this narrative is based on this kind of, you could say, an imagined community or narrative of a single people from Russia, ethnically close to one another. Countries like, Russia, of course, Ukraine, Belarus. And if we read this narrative, it also includes many other states in Central Europe, this Russosphere. So just before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Putin declared that Ukraine is an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space. And if we look at India under Modi, the Hindu nationalist leader of India, well, he's been extremely popular and successful in an electoral sense. And it appears as though his popularity has been strongly propelled by his Hindu nationalist reimagining of India from an inclusive, secular state, democratic state, to an increasingly authoritarian Hindu state based on this narrative of Hindutva. So, in the case of Indonesia and Malaysia, founding nationalists Sukarno and Tunku Abdul Rahman of Malaysia were undeniably inspired by what has been referred to earlier as modernization theories of political, social, and economic development, what they believe to be occurring in the industrial West, the industrialized, inclusive, secular democratic states in the West, but as well as modernizing secular states from the Middle East that were authoritarian, strongly authoritarian in orientation. So, more than 6 decades after Malaysia attained political independence in 1957, the country remains beleaguered and plagued by numerous unsettled national questions pertaining to the character of the state and key articles in the Independence Constitution, the Merdeka Constitution. These unsettled national questions have, I argue in my paper, hindered the development of a cohesive national identity. And as Mavis Putucherry, a Malaysian social scientist, so insightfully observed, no nation can be securely grounded if the founding charter of its existence is confused and contested. A frail or fractured foundation is no basis for sharing a nation. So now let's look at key unsettled national questions that is plaguing Malaysia. They include the character of the post-colonial state. Is it secular? Is it quasi-secular? Or is it Islamic? And whether Article 3 of the Malaysian Constitution, which recognizes that Islam is the religion of the federation, but also other religions may be practiced in peace and harmony in any part of the federation? Does that allow for Malay Muslim hegemony based on the Ketuanan Melayu doctrine, Ketuanan Melayu Islam doctrine, Malay Muslim dominance doctrine, as well as the establishment of an Islamic state? The other unsettled national question, whether the civil courts and Sharia courts are of equal status. They were initially, but since the 1980s, with state-led Islamization, this status appears to be more horizontal. Whether the civil courts have the constitutional right to override Sharia court rulings and fatwas. Initially, in the initial post-independence period, this was the case. The other unsettled national question, whether the sultans or the state ulama constitute the key arbiters in matters pertaining to Islam. The other question, whether the Sharia courts have the constitutional power to override the letter as well as the spirit of the secular post-colonial constitution. Whether the Malay Bumiputra indigenous community and their special status, as noted in Article 153 of the Constitution, entitle this indigenous community to ethnic-based affirmative action policies in perpetuity. And lastly, whether ethnic and religious minorities are entitled to equal citizenship rights. So it is worth noting that Malaysia's founding Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman had repeatedly affirmed the secular foundations of the Constitution as well as the state. And other earlier Malaysian prime ministers, such as Tun Abdul Razak Hussein and Hussein On, similarly affirmed Malaysia's secular democratic state moorings, a state based on equal citizenship rights. But this debate continues. It continues despite Malaysia's national ideology called the Rukun Negara, which clearly states and is consistent with the spirit of the secular federal constitution that this national ideology is geared towards promoting democratic values and is in unity with the multi-ethnic and multi-religious fabric of the nation state. So these are the unifying Rukun Negara principles. Similar to the Pancasila, and many have argued that the Rukun Negara was very much inspired by Indonesia's Pancasila national ideology. The first one, belief in God. It doesn't say belief in Islam, even though Islam has been designated as the national faith, but believe in God. Achievement of a more perfect national unity. I think this was lifted from probably the American Constitution, a more perfect national union. Preservation of a democratic way of life. Creation of a just society where economic prosperity can be enjoyed in a fair and equitable manner. This resonates with the Pancasila. What's interesting is the specific mentioning of guaranteeing a liberal approach towards the rich and varied cultural traditions of the nation state. And Malaysia's constitution has various articles in it which guarantee liberal democratic rights. Lastly, building a progressive society through science and modern technology. So the Rukun Negara's emphasis on democracy, liberalism, and the building of a progressive society based on science and technology have been viewed cynically by conservative Islamists wedded to the primacy of Sharia law and also very keen on establishing an Islamic state for Malaysia. Now, I believe I have run out of time, but I'll go through a few key points very quickly. Now, the Rukun Negara has been contradicted by another doctrine, and that is the Ketuanan Melayu doctrine, the hegemony of the Malay people, the Bumiputras, as well as Islam in the country, premised on the notion that they are the traditional owners of the land as indigenous people, and therefore have special privileges and rights, including this right of social political dominance in perpetuity. So this is a logic of entitlement. What's interesting is that this doctrine does not appear in the Malaysian Federal Constitution, nor was it mentioned by nationalist leaders during that period. Nevertheless, we find a systematic elevation of the Ketuanan Melayu Islam doctrine, and many argue it has even surpassed the significance of the national ideology in Malaysia, Rukun Negara, which I outlined earlier on. Now, the Barisan Nasional government, which was in power for more than 6 decades, was overturned via the elections in 2018. But this new coalition government that's only in power for 22 months promised a new Malaysia based on comprehensive socio-economic political reforms. However, if you read their election manifesto and the speeches of the Pakatan coalition leadership, such as, for example, speeches of Mahathir Mohamad, the Pakatan Prime Minister during that period, you will find that they have been relatively muted and quiet with regard to Ketuanan Melayu. And the literature that has come out in the last year or so suggests that Mahathir and many Pakatan reformists, ostensibly reformist leaders, were in fact wedded, very much wedded to Ketuanan Melayu, despite professing this promotion of a new Malaysia. So we have this oscillation, this tussle by progressive, so ostensibly progressive forces within the opposition claiming that they want to generate and promote a new Malaysia, but unwilling to challenge key aspects of Ketuanan Melayu. And this allowed them to be challenged quite easily by Ketuanan Melayu advocates within UMNO. And it's no surprise that this government collapsed in what can be referred to as a coup only after 22 months in power. Now, what has happened since then is quite interesting. We find that the conservative Islamists appear to have made advancements, but also setbacks. For example, the civil courts have reasserted their constitutional prerogatives by challenging various Sharia court rulings. And this is quite startling because in the past, the civil courts have been very reluctant to do this, but not so since the fall of the Pakatan Harapan government. So since I've run out of time, I'll just highlight this a few points, key themes which are related to the questions posed to the presenters, related to the three questions, the various questions. What I want to highlight is the significance of equal citizenship rights for Muslim women, non-Muslims, Muslim minority sects, and other minority groups, and whether Sharia law can provide for this in a multi-religious, multi-ethnic society. The theory and reality of the Islamic State, most of them being authoritarian, and most democracies in the Muslim world, such as Indonesia, work within the paradigm of an inclusive secular state. Thirdly, the need to explore not just, what is fashionable these days, white privilege, but also Arab privilege in the Muslim world. And this, links up to the peripheral status of non-Arab Muslim intellectuals in the Muslim world. Why are the ideas, for example, of Amina Wadud, an African-American, not particularly receptive in the Arab world? The ideas of Abdullahi An-Naim, for example, and other non-Arab Muslim intellectuals from Southeast Asia and other parts of the Muslim world. But in Indonesia, we find concepts such as Nusantara Islam, resonating in many parts of the non-Arab Muslim world. The Indonesian political model of democratization, and indeed the role of tertiary institutions such as UIII, the significance of that in promoting a progressive model of a Muslim state and society. So what I emphasize is the importance of exploring Muslim politics within a comparative context as well as political economic context. In view of the fact that similar challenges are also found in the non-Muslim world, as found in the Muslim world. As noted earlier, the impact of neoliberal globalism internationally, impacting the Muslim as well as the non-Muslim world. And as a result of that, the cultural and economic backlashes. Cultural backlashes is manifested in anti-immigration sentiments, anti-refugee sentiments promoted by populist politicians, economic backlashes against, for example, free trade agreements, campaigns against rising income inequality. And ethno and religious nationalist politicians in the Muslim and non-Muslim world have exploited the contradictions associated with neoliberal globalism. And lastly, the challenges of building a sustainable and inclusive multiracial democracy. These are key challenges that are quite obvious to us in the Muslim world, as well as even in the mature liberal democracies such as the United States and other parts of Europe. And I'll end my talk there, and my apologies for surpassing the time accorded to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rahim, for insightful presentation and for highlighting, in my view, non-Arab case of the study of Muslims politics, especially You highlight the struggle in Indonesia and Malaysia, how the two countries always struggles to try to get the balance of state and religion relations. And then you highlight that at least in the two countries, the question of how we maintain equal citizenship, which is very important to maintain the two countries with the idea to some extent, some liberal values that we can actually find in the constitutions of Indonesia and Malaysia. And then the three highlights that you also mentioned, in addition to the equal citizenship principles, is that we need to explore and questions the privileges, not only white privileges, but also Arab privileges when it comes to the question of a Muslim society. The stance of non-Arab Muslim scholars, you highlighted that as well. And then the initiative like the university that we are trying to build here probably fall within that context as well. And then lastly, you remind us of the challenge of maintaining and building multiracial democracy in Muslim societies. And that's, I think, the real struggle in front of us. Now, we have the third speaker, that is Professor Ahmad Kuru from San Diego State University. In Indonesia, he needs no introduction, right? Because his book now has been widely read and get some many reviews in the Indonesian media and also in various academic platforms. But Professor Ahmad Kuru has some connection problem, so he will be connected to us through my colleague's cell phone, Dr. Sirajuddin Arif, and but we will hear his voice through the phone, and we will see and observe his slides. Professor Ahmad Kuru, could you hear me here?
Hello. Yes, I'm hearing you.
All right, so the screen is yours, or the microphone is yours, Professor Ahmad Kuru.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I am very sorry for being unable to attend you today because I am in a mountain, unfortunately, with very bad internet connection. I hope you can hear me, and Pak Sirajuddin help us to show my PowerPoint presentation I prepared for this conference. I'm very thankful to International Indonesia University, UIII, for inviting me to this conference. And I'm also proud that they invited me to give an online course last semester. And I'm happy to see that some of my students presenting their papers in this conference, which is another source of pride and happiness for me. So this conference is very important because we are launching our new journal on Muslim politics. And the concept of Muslim politics developed by Professor Piscatori and Ackerman in their book about the Muslim politics. And today, we are discussing big problems in the Muslim world. My presentation is going to focus on two of these problems, hierarchy and literalism. When the paper published in the article format, you will be able to see the argument in an elaborated way. Hopefully you now see the PowerPoint presentation with the title about the problem of hierarchy and literalism in the Muslim world. And these two problems are at the core of Muslim epistemology. If Pak Sirajuddin moved to the second slide, you see that Moroccan philosopher Muhammad Abed al-Jabiri emphasizes that if we are summarizing Greek civilization, he says, I would say the civilization of philosophy. And if he's asking about Islamic civilization. He says it's a civilization of law and jurisprudence, basically. Personality and continues. If you ask me to emphasize an individual for Britain, an English civilization, I would say John Locke and his empiricism. For the French, I would say Descartes and his Cartesian rationalism. But for the Muslim world, it is Imam Shafi and his usul of fiqh, basically the rules of jurisprudence. So why is it important? In the Muslim world today, in majority countries, as the next slide in my PowerPoint presentation is showing you, there is a mixture of Islamic regimes and secular regimes. About 18 or so countries have Sharia-based constitutions, 22 or so have secular constitutions, and 10 have mixed constitutions. But still, even in secular countries like Turkey, I was born and grow up, and mixed countries like Algeria, Tunisia, the Islamic law, jurisprudence is still very important. People's understanding of religion, people's understanding of worldview. So what is this epistemology, usul al-fiqh? How is it important? If Sirajuddin move to the next slide, you will see that how I discussed in my book, Islam, Authoritarianism and Underdevelopment, also translated into Indonesian, alhamdulillah, how before the 11th century, there were multiple Islamic understandings, especially the one led by Abu Hanifa, the founder of Hanafi school. Abu Hanifa emphasizes the role of reason, and his school was based on Ray. Ray basically means opinion of an Islamic scholar is a wise person. But later on, Imam Shafi and Ahmed ibn Hanbal developed more literalist approach called Ahl Hadith rather than Ahl Ray, Ahl Hadith. But eventually, this Ahl Hadith notion systematized by Imam Shafi became dominant. And today, all Sunni four schools, Hanefi, Hanbali, Maliki, Shafi, follow Imam Shafi's school. Even if Turkey, Pakistan, Central Asia, which are Hanefi, still they follow Imam Shafi's notion of Islamic law. So what is it? If you next move to the next slide in my PowerPoint presentation, you see that Imam Shafi's school and understanding of Islamic law is based on 4 parameters: Quran, Hadith, Ijma, Qiyas. This is perfectly fine because Quran is our sacred book, Hadith is the record of the Prophet ﷺ's hadiths and sayings. But the 3rd and 4th parameters are controversial. And I'm criticizing them because Ijma is taken very narrow way as the consensus of the ulama. Although the ulama, Islamic scholars, justify the Ijma consensus based on an hadith saying that my community never agree upon error. The fact that the hadith is not referring to ulama, but it only refers to community, Islamic ummah. Therefore, today's understanding of Ijma is very hierarchical. It put madrasa graduates upon all of us. If we are not madrasa graduates, we cannot interpret Islam, which is a problem. This is the problem of hierarchy and authority. But the hadith says, my community never upon error. Therefore, each community member should be allowed to participate in discussions about Islam. The next problem, is the qiyas. Qiyas basically means analogical reasoning, which marginalize and put reason as simply analogical. But Abu Hanifa put reason as an important factor to understand Islam. But in this Imam Shafi method, it only makes analogies. For example, if you ask me, is smoking forbidden? I look at the Quran, Hadith, Ijma, nothing. And then I make an analogy with drinking and say it is haram, something like that. But you cannot use reason, data, science, empirical knowledge in this very literalist notion of Islam developed by Hanbali and Shafi and later accepted by Hanafis and Malikis too. So let me emphasize that I am not providing a Sunni Hanafi critique of Imam Shafi because I am coming from Turkey. No, because even in Turkey, even Hanafis accept Imam Shafi's method. But this method is very hierarchical and literalist. If we move to next slide in my PowerPoint presentation, you see that I give examples of problems. One problem is understanding history. If, for example, you criticize Umayyads and their founding father Muawiyah and his politics and wars against Ali radiallahu anh, someone come with a hadith and say, there is a hadith, follow my Sahaba, they are like stars in the sky. If you follow each one of them, you'll find falah and salvation or good way. But this is against understanding of history. We should be able to look at history as it is in an objective way. And if Muawiyah had mistakes, they should be accepted, not rejected in a literalist way. Another problem is slavery. Since Muslims didn't use reason very well and didn't understand Islam's broad message with a hierarchical and literalist understanding of Islam, they did not abolish slavery until the 19th century, and they did it after Europeans did it. Normally, we would expect Muslims abolish slavery before Europeans. Another example is women's rights. In the Gulf countries today, ulama didn't allow women to be leaders, even to vote in elections in a very strict and literalist understanding of Islam, which is a problem. For medical science, there were many restrictions ulama put, eventually removed, but why did we lose centuries waiting? Because of the hierarchical and understanding of Islam. So my next and last slide in my PowerPoint presentation is about solutions to the problem. What to be done? What can we do to provide solutions? In fact, the discussions start much earlier. As I said, Abu Hanifa emphasized reason. Then in the 16th century, Imam Shatibi, a Muslim Andalusian Islamic law scholar from Spain, Imam Shatibi said in 16th century that Islamic law is insufficient to respond to the challenges of the time. And therefore, he said, we need Maqasid al-Sharia, the 6 objectives of Islam: protecting life, prosperity, religion, reason, and property. And he said, by focusing on these broad messages and higher objectives of Islam, we can respond to the challenges of time. So if Imam Shatibi had seen us today in 21st century, with still very hierarchical and strict understanding of Islamic law, he would have been very surprised. Because 500 years ago, he said that we need a new approach. And today, Fazlur Rahman and other scholars emphasize that we need to look at broad objectives of Islam. And let me conclude my presentation by pointing the issue of democracy. If we want democracy, Indonesia, Albania, and few Muslim countries have democracies, and they look at their democracy. But 45 out of 50 Muslim majority countries are authoritarian. The true democracy requires the people's participation in lawmaking. Law should be made by people's participation using reasoning. Therefore, democracy requires a new understanding of law, a very literalist and a very hierarchical understanding of law, contradicts a very basic notion of democracy. So that's another reason why I'm asking Muslims to really rethink this usul fiqh, its emphasis as an epistemology, its emphasis as a legal system. And today we really need more participatory, more reason-based understanding of Islam, which will be much more compatible with democracy. And that's what we really need to think about that. Thank you very much again for the organizers of the conference. Thanks to the youth of III, and I look forward to the new launching of our journal on Muslim politics, and hopefully my presentation will be published there. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Thank you, Professor Ahmed Kuru, for your presentation and highlighting the need for new epistemology with regard to various things that needs to be done. You mentioned about the need for reform, reforming and inclusion of empirical knowledge and rationalism, and so on and so forth. That would require participation of the society, and that is the problems that we highlight in the in various Muslim societies. Now, Professor Saiful Mujani could not attend this session, but he did submit his essays, paper responding to Professor James Piscatori, and it would do no justice if I read his paper, but his paper will for sure be included in the journal that will be coming out in the next few months. So now we have about 30 minutes for Q&A, and I've seen some questions, but if I may, using some powers that I have as a moderator, I would ask questions to Professor James Piscatori and Professor Rahim also, if possible. If I think Professor Rahim is still with us. Yeah. Oh yes, Professor Rahim is still with us. Thank you. My question is, the two of you and Professor Ahmed Kuru as well have yet to highlight the political contestation that comes in the form of election in Muslim societies. How do you see this? Because, you know, we do have election in Muslim societies, and even it become some kind of very difficult contestation sometimes with election, because differences would be highlighted in election, in campaign, and so on. And somebody in the Q&A box asked specifically about Indonesia or what happened in some of our local elections, where religion is at the forefront of the debate, and that probably would mark even sharp differences within the society. Instead of we know there's this moderation effect theory of of Muslim societies. If you have election, then moderation will take place, so to speak. But we see the opposite happening sometimes. So how do you see this problem of political contestation in the form of election in Muslim societies? Professor James Piscatori and Professor Rahim and Professor Ahmed Kuru after that, please.
Yes, thanks very much. I saw the question specifically about Indonesia, and I'll leave that to Greg Feely and other experts on Indonesia to answer. But the broader question is a good one. And it goes to the heart of what Professor Kuru just said about the need to rethink democracy. So we have endless debates about whether elections are merely cosmetic. Is it a facade democracy? And we certainly can agree that they have been manipulated in various ways. Let's leave that point. Let's accept that. Let's accept that elections are manipulated, and that they don't represent necessarily the will of the people. But they do two things, I think, which kind of connects with what Professor Rahim was saying as well, which is that they tell us that society has a place to play. And even if the rules are not fair, even if it's not manipulated, there is some concession to the need to defer, or at least to encourage some form of societal participation. So I think that that's useful in a long run. And that connects with the point about imagining. Clearly, I think I'm right in saying that many of you will agree that in the elections in Indonesia, certainly in the case in Egypt and other places, there's a manipulation of religion for political party purposes or for personal power purposes. So instrumentalization of Islam for political power is evident. It's just a fact of life. But in the longer run, like for example, in Indonesia, with debates over what place does blasphemy have in a modern political society, those are being contested and played out in the political sphere, and to some extent within the electoral sphere. And to the extent that those occur, I would say that in the longer run, this creates some possibilities of culture change, or at least a kind of rethinking of the situation, a reimagination, to use Professor Rahim's words. So I wouldn't rule it out entirely, but I would say it's part of that broader contestation.
Thank you, Professor Piscatori. Professor Lil Rahim, would you want to respond as well to that question?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of literature on elections and their value, their worth, particularly with regard to aiding the processes associated with democratization. Well, if we look at Malaysia, for example, the Malaysian case study, the Barisan National Government had been in power for more than 61 years. And they were finally booted out in 2018. And many did not even believe that it had happened. In fact, much has been written about the Pakatan Harapan coalition. The leadership didn't even believe that they were going to win, which is why they made all these lavish election promises. Nevertheless, I think in electoral authoritarian polities, elections are important, particularly in an era where social media is significant. And in countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on, a lot of the voter does not rely on the mainstream media and the government press for information. They rely on social media and various outlets. And this has made a difference in places like Malaysia. Civil society has played a significant role as well. Civil society, progressive civil society, working with politicians committed towards political reform. In the case of Malaysia, that contributed to the final ouster of Barisan. But the point here is that one cannot expect opposition parties, in the case of Malaysia and similar countries, opposition coalitions cannot expect to win after one or two goes. In the case of Malaysia, the opposition began to be successful in 1999 after the regional financial crisis. And then in 2008, they nearly won. And then 2013, it nearly happened as well. So it's not a one-shot thing. One has to be serious about this marathon. It's a bit of a marathon. Now, political funding is important. Political funding rules and regulations. In places like Malaysia, the opposition has been pushing for this because often incumbent political parties in power have been able to accrue funding from various sources within their own, support from, say, business groups and others. But this is not accounted for. So this has contributed towards corruption on a grand scale. And the 1MDB corruption scandal was about that. Former Prime Minister Najib had apparently built up this huge, financial resource base because he was basically, he had to engage in this patronage politics system whereby you need to pay your supporters to turn up and vote, and also people at the district level. So there needs to be, I think, institutional reforms, policy reforms to allow for elections to operate on a level playing field. So with regard to the political moderation theory, I kind of insinuated in my presentation that in the case of Malaysia, it has not really moderated the more conservative Islamists who have been participating in elections since independence. Why not? Why have they not moderated? Well, in my case, I use a more kind of a higher bar. Do they subscribe to the notion of equal citizenship rights for women, for non-Muslims, for Muslim minority sects, other minority groups? No. Till this day, they are not firmly committed to equal citizenship rights for Muslims, for non-Muslims. And so, so in the case of Malaysia and many other countries, their participation has in many respects reinforced their conservative values and ideas, so especially when the state co-opts their conservative Islamist agenda. And I've carried on for a while now. I'll be able to talk about this for hours because it's a very exciting topic, but I'll end off here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rahim. I'm not sure if Professor Ahmed Kuru is still connected to the phone, Dr. Sirajuddin. Is he still connected?
Yes, Pak Kuru is still connected.
All right, Pak. Professor Kuru, if I may, the same question with slightly different version, that you speak about ulama state coalition, and would you think election would break that kind of alliance between ulama and the state, that according to your book is part of the reason why there is this undemocratic and underdeveloped Muslim societies? Pak Siro. We could not hear you. Oh, there you go. Yes, now we can hear you, Professor Abdul. Yes.
Hello.
Yes, please.
Is it clear, Pak Philip?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes,
Can
Pak.
you hear me?
Yes,
Raju?
yes.
Yes, okay, I'm continuing that. Okay, so elections per se are not sufficient. We need freedoms and liberties to really maintain a democracy. That's the problem in the Muslim majority countries, and also what we call competitive authoritarianism in Russia and some other regimes with elections, but not through democracy. For example, in many Muslim majority countries, there are blasphemy laws. I know that in Indonesia, there is one case about the mayor of Jakarta, but it is not as severe as it is in Pakistan. In Pakistan, unfortunately, over 100 people have been lynched by mobs because of the blasphemy accusations, and over 1,000 people have been sued in courts. And if freedom of speech is so restricted, even if you have elections, you cannot talk about democracy. In Iran, there are elections, but it is a semi-theocratic regime. And since Pak Philip referred kindly to my book and my argument about ulama-state alliance, Iran, in the Shia version, is today a paramount example of ulama-state alliance. And in fact, ulama is not only an ally of the state, but also it claims to be the state, like saying, let us say no, the state, it is us, the ulama, because of the, as you know, Khomeini's Walayat al-Faqih idea that the Faqih, the Islamic scholars, should be supreme, guarding the political system. Even if you have elections, you can have a democracy if you have supreme leader of Khamenei or Khomeini in Iran or elsewhere. So therefore, in the Muslim world, we have to emphasize that elections should be supported by liberties. Blasphemy laws should be either moderated or abolished. Ulama-state alliance should be minimized. Ulama should not control courts and legal systems. And as I emphasized in my presentation, ulama should not have an hegemony over lawmaking. People with their representatives or with direct participation should be able to change the laws. So freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of participation, all of them are crucial for a democracy. My second point for this important question is that in the Muslim world, there was the moderation argument, but we didn't see much moderation in Islamic parties, unfortunately. In Turkey, in Tunisia, in Egypt, many Islamic groups try to use democratic system in order to establish their hegemonies. I think Ennahda in Tunisia was the most successful case to show Islam and democracy compatible. But it is a spectrum. Some Tunisian can also criticize Ennahda. The worst case on the other end of the spectrum is, of course, Taliban in Afghanistan. In the middle, you have many cases, including Turkey's Erdogan regime and NKP. So what was the argument? The argument was that Islamic parties should be allowed in elections. They will eventually be moderated. Some of them be moderated, but many did not. The reason is that, as I am emphasizing in my presentation, their understanding of law and politics is very much top-down, and their understanding of Sharia is very strict rules, and they use democracy as a means. And these Islamists did not engage with democratic institutions to learn something. One barrier, one problem is anti-Westernism. Because in the mindset of many Islamists, democracy is a Western institution and a Western product. Therefore, anti-Westernism is so deep that they didn't learn anything from democratic institutions. They use democratic arguments in order to gain space and ground as a means, but they never have a mutual engagement to have a transformation. They don't transform. And at the end, we see that wherever they come to power, there is the possibility that elections will become either a non-democratic tool or cancel completely. So what is the solution? The solution is really require us a reform, a new religious understanding, a new political understanding, a really honesty. Let me conclude by referring to the case of Turkey, which was supposed to be a model country, but today, unfortunately, it has a deep economic crisis, and over 100,000 people are in jail for political accusations with no true criminal records. And the Islamist arguments are used to justify authoritarian regimes, authoritarian policies, and it really brings a reaction, a secularist backlash. I am worried that after an Islamic authoritarianism, Turkey will see a secular authoritarianism. And in order to avoid this cycle of religious and secular authoritarianism, we really need to put democracy at the center of our debate. Yes, Muslims may bring arguments based on Islam and their understanding of Islam, but they need to justify it in the public sphere rather than imposing authoritarian manner. I think that's the key of the concept of Muslim politics. Professor Piscatori developed and coined, and our journal Muslim Politics will emphasize yes to Muslim participation in politics, but no to Islamist hijacking of democracies and elections. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ahmed Kuru. I see Professor Piscatori raise his hand. Would you jump into the discussion, Professor Piscatori? Yes.
Just a quick point. I want to thank my two colleagues for very, I think, bravely taking the analysis further. I want to also acknowledge a kind of timidity to the Muslim Politics book. So the point of the book was to talk about contestation without necessarily an end game. So we've had here both Professor Rahim and Professor Kuru, both in effect making comments about the way Muslim society should be. I perfectly agree with your analyses. I hope this is the way it goes. But what we did in Muslim politics, which may not be enough, was simply to document that there was contestation and the reasons for that contestation. So it may be that we miss those high bars. It may be that authoritarianism is ingrained in various ways. But to me, that's part of Muslim politics. So in some ways, I would encourage all of us to think about to what extent the prescriptive becomes part of the analytical element of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Piscatori. And there are some questions that I think all the panelists in one way or another have already addressed. But there are questions from Aldi, and if I may paraphrase the question, and it seems to me that the question is for Professor Piscatori. This is the question about globalization and technology. And if I may paraphrase his question, Aldi, that pandemic, we see after the pandemic and still in the pandemic, some kind of a deglobalization that, countries are looking inward. And then that would include in Muslim societies. So the effect of globalization, as you said, is not homogenization, but then you also in your presentation mentioned that the pandemic, during the pandemic, state become the strongest unit that would provide services to the public. But exactly the problem of governance is the problem in Muslim societies. And when we have this deglobalization, countries retreating, then the problem will be self-centered. And how do you see this playing out in Muslim societies?
Well, I think it's clear that both are occurring, and all the literature supports this, and I think some of you have written on this subject, that it supports the idea that we have, the greater interconnectedness and the awareness that follows from that greater interconnectedness. So that's part of it. But it's also the case that it doesn't simply level the field. It doesn't simply get rid of cultural changes. Now, we've had, people like Ali Mazrui made this point a long time ago when he said that it was a form of hegemonization which leads to homogenization. So, and Ernest Gellner said the same thing, that we fear that there'll be kind of a low-level world culture, Disneyfication, McDonaldization. And to a certain extent, that commodification is absolutely true. But at the same time, it gives rise to all these local differences. And I actually think that in the case of the pandemic, as you say, Dean Phillips, both, the need to kind of connect up with the rest of the world to deal with it. But basically, end of the day, who is the one who delivered the vaccines? Who is the one who created the new health regimes? The states. And so, in effect, it reinforced local political authorities. So, to my mind, in some ways, the balance is a little bit in favor of the state in the current situation, though we can't ignore the fact that globalizing trends have had a change of consciousness or awareness. So, in a way, both.
Thank you, Professor Piscatori. I see in the Q&A box, there's a question for Professor Rahim from Muhammad Farid Hafez Muhammad Umar. The question is basically, would you think in the context of Malaysia or Indonesia, would you think Islamism is really a great issue to deal with to gain power? Is it all the issues about power, struggle in the two countries, or otherwise it will be used in stabilizing? Islam can be the stabilizing force actually of contestation within society. How do you see this, Professor Rahim?
Yeah, well, like anything else, Islam could be a stabilizing force or a destabilizing force. The same with Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, and so on. So it's the actors that are important. We talked about the state. We need to understand the state. What sort of state is this? Is this an authoritarian state? Is it a quasi-authoritarian? Is it an electoral authoritarian? Is it a democratic state? Is it a liberal democracy? Is it an effective state in governance terms? Does the state have significant capacity to provide social services, to create jobs, to navigate the global economy, to navigate economic and financial crises? In the case of East Asia, the broader East Asian region, which includes Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, we do have models of effective states that have been able to deliver the material goods, plural democracies, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan. At one stage, Malaysia was also a beacon in the 80s and 90s. Not so. Indonesia today is also believed by many as a potential beacon in the region if it addresses various issues and challenges. And I believe much of it related to how to make the system more democratic, transparent, accountability. And in the case of Malaysia, I've always subscribed to the view that this is the way to go for a country like Malaysia, caught in the middle income trap, how to move up to the developed economy, developed nation status. And you need a vibrant, innovative, creative knowledge economy. In order to have that, you also need an innovative, creative, knowledgeable society. You can't have one without the other, I would argue. Now, the China model, posits that you can have that innovative, creative, dynamic economy within the framework of an authoritarian state. But I think it is still early days yet to say that that is possible. So China is, attempting to cross that bridge to present that case. But now coming back to, say, the pandemic, if we look at countries that produced the vaccines effectively, where were they from? If we look at countries that have come up with cutting edge technology, where are they from? They are not rentier economies. They tend not to be. And Ahmed Kuru has done excellent work on the correlation between rentier economies and democratic polities, and also the relationship between the secular state and the differences between the different secular states. So I would still argue this point that for countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, they need to look at models, not necessarily Muslim majority states, but models where countries that have been effective in making that transition from authoritarian polities to plural societies and political systems in Northeast Asia and other parts of the world. But more relevant, as I noted earlier, to countries like Indonesia and Malaysia is the Northeast Asian developmental states, where development has been propelled by an activist state, a state that works with the private sector. So it's not really the free market at play. It's an interventionist state that has the larger picture, that works in the national interest, that is not hijacked by business groups, by plutocrats, and all the other crats plaguing many market economies, even in the United States, you could say. So there are these models. But I think coming back to the other point noted earlier, it's not a case of one size fits all. One has to take into consideration the history of a country, the various social groups, and so on, the capacity of the private sector, local private capital, and so on. And also investment in human capital, joint ventures with companies. There's all sorts of approaches that could be adopted. And I think I've again said too much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rahim. We have 2 minutes left. James Piscatori, Professor James Piscatori, there's a question from Safi Anwar. And then I think this question is specifically for you. How do you see the opposite tendencies of globalization and rising fundamentalism? Globalization, as you said, is increasing interconnectedness and so on and so on. So we would be able to see differences, to some extent, moderation effect, if you will. But at the same time, you see this rising fundamentalism in various parts of the world. What are the main driver of these two tendencies?
I think there is a connection. It's clear that fundamentalism or Islamism, whatever you want to call it, there are multiple factors which account for it. So we could delineate, political economy, we could delineate ideological shifts, we could talk about social dislocation, etc. But in many ways, the processes of globalization are also contributory in the sense of this relativization that I was talking about. To the extent that Muslims, and here we'll use fundamentalism as the term, become aware that there are other fundamentalists, that there are Hindu fundamentalists, that there are Christian fundamentalists, etc. To the extent that they understand that there are others, this in fact intensifies a kind of competition. And the competition, in a way, can take quite unsavory, rather, and some, as you know, right, quite nasty forms at times. And, you know, I like the terminology of Peter Berger, a sociologist of religion, who talked about micro-totalitarianism. And this goes back to what the other speakers were referring to, the imposition on society of your own views, regardless of what the multiplicity of views. In other words, to relativize religion or Islam through globalization processes means that you understate the validity of pluralism, whether it's women or minorities, and the rights of others, etc. And that is directly contributory to, I think, to some of what we've seen with fundamentalists. So I would link them to some extent.
Thank you, Professor Piscatori. It's 9 p.m. already in Jakarta. And thank you very much for Professor James Piscatori, Professor Lily Rahim, and Professor Ahmed Guru for your very generous time with us, and also your insights that would certainly help us at the university, and hopefully for the audience as well, to think about the research agenda of this phenomenon that we call Muslim politics, that has changed a lot. And then there are various factors that need to be taken into account. And then we are happy that we have this symposium for the first time. The past 3 days, if I may report to the panelists here, have been fantastic, well attended, and the discussions, if I may, my personal view, maybe part of the biases that Professor Piscatori mentioned, but the discussion has been lively, and we learn a lot. We are hoping that our journal will come soon, and then hope to see you again, hopefully next year, or if not, very soon in Jakarta. If you happen to be in Indonesia, please do let us know, Professor Piscatori, Professor Rahim, and Professor Guru. And also thank you to the participants who has been, very eagerly participating in this session, although it is conducted at night. But I think it's because the participants also agree that we need to always think about this phenomenon that we call Muslim politics. So please join me in thanking the three distinguished speakers for their insights, online appreciation. Thank you very much, Prof. James Piscatori, Professor Lili Rahim, and Professor Ahmad Guru one more time. Thank you. And thank you all.
Thank you very much. It's very stimulating.
Yeah, lastly, I would like to thank everybody at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University, Indonesian Islamic University, for preparing this 3 days conferences, and for conceptualizing the symposium and do the technical preparation. Of course, we cannot mention names, but they have been very helpful as well in in organizing this symposium. Thank you very much. So I'll see you soon, hopefully physically in Indonesia. Thank you very much. Have a good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
very much. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thanks very much. Congratulations.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.